Hello Renaissance artists, Jessica Henry here. We are in the 5th module today of Painting the Portrait. What we're going to talk about today is just laying down, again, the beginning foundations of a portrait. Today I really want to just go back and review some of those essentials of getting the measurements and the likeness accurate, as well as isolating the value shapes. So we're going to keep today's lesson very simple. It'll be a one-time lesson. You can just do this one as many times as you want with different photographs and images that you may have on hand. All right, so let's get going. All right, so you won't be able to see much of my palette today unless I hold it up and specifically show you some of the skin tones, because mostly what I'm going to be working on is just laying in the drawing of this onto my canvas, and the way that I do that with moving around the paint instead of using a pencil. So I'm going to do this almost sight size. I might make her a little bit larger, or I may just keep her about that same size right here on my canvas. This is a linen 8x10 panel. And what I'm going to be using today for the most part is ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. So I have my cup of Gamsol or odorless mineral spirits, and I'm going to start out with just a simple tone over the whole canvas. And this is mostly burnt sienna with just a touch of ultramarine blue, just to tone it down a little bit. And in my mind, as I'm approaching this painting, I'm already starting to think about size and placement. And like I said at the beginning, I assume she'll be roughly the same size, but sometimes when you start making marks, you really kind of have to gauge what feels comfortable and best in the confines of your rectangle. So I make my canvas a little bit darker than I need, because I know that I'm going to rub some of this off. So holding on to that. And by rubbing this off just a little bit, I'm not pressing very hard, but it takes the top layer of just that glistening moisture off the surface of the canvas. So I break it up and give it a little bit of texture here, kind of this way and that way. I guess I have some blue on there, but that's okay. All right. Now I'm going to use a little bit smaller paintbrush. This is a size 3. Well, now it's a filbert. And I'm still thinning it down just a little bit of Gamsol and blue and brown in there. So looking at her, and I think the top of her head should be about in there. That's a nice distance. And since she's looking that way, I'm going to give her a little bit more space on this side of the canvas. So the edge of her head will be over here, and the edge of the head will be, I think, about in that general area. So I think if I keep her in about this area, that just kind of makes sense. So top of the head, no higher than that, and this is the edge. And her hair can kind of be in that area, just about like that. So grabbing my brush, she is a child, so her eyes are going to be below the halfway mark. So I thought that I would pick a portrait today that was fairly straight on, just to talk about facial divisions a little bit too. And it's okay that she's a child, because it's more or less the same. So here's our general oval. And an adult would have the eye dividing line right in the middle. But she has, she's younger, so her eye dividing line is going to be a little bit lower. And they're slightly tipped. Just a little bit. And so give yourself that line right there in the middle. And her nose takes that portion down below then, and it is about in half. And then below that is about where the mouth is, in half. So any person you can divide about that way. So an adult would be in half, and then in half, and then in half. So that's how that works. And then the top part of her head we're gonna give her, children have a little bit more forehead, so we'll divide that in about a half. And then the rest of this just comes back that way. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to map out where her eyes are in this situation here. So we've got one eye about here and the other eye about in there. All right, with those in place, I'm gonna map out then where the eye socket is. And this is gonna give you the likeness. So I'm using a little bit more sienna. Still, it's pretty thin. The eye socket comes up, and then the eyebrow is over that way. And then the edge of the face is very close to the edge of the eye socket. So we're bringing that over. I always like to establish one thing as what I call my truth. So let's just establish this eye in the shadow area over here as truth. Okay, so we're going to darken all this in just a little bit more. It's okay to go and darken in the whole eye cavity and then work on carving out where the eye and the highlights are and so forth once you get it in place. And then her temple curves and goes back from the eye socket. So while I have that tone on my brush, we'll just give that a little place in there. And then the bridge of her nose is very small right there. And this eye socket just kind of blends over into the other socket over here. Okay, so we established that this is where her other eye is. I'm going to make her eye over here just a little darker so we can have an idea of where it is inside the socket. Okay, so that means over here, along that same horizontal line I gave us, the other one sits about there. So then her eye socket over here, that needs to be thinner and a little lighter. Adding more Gamsol will make your wash a little bit lighter. So her eye socket comes about like this. And then this is all kind of hidden with hair over here. So let's give this a little bit of shadow. And then it comes around and under the eye a little bit. Like that, and a little more shadow back in here. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is, since these are pretty much established in place, I'm going to measure and make sure that they are the right distance apart. So coming over here, I'm going to go backwards with my finger here. I'm going to take the measurement of the eye first. So putting my thumb in the corner of her eye and the tip of my brush at the edge of her eye. So that is how wide her eye is. Just like that. I'm checking now the width in between her eyes. Putting the tip of my brush on the corner of her eye socket over here, measuring across. The tip of my thumb then is about at the corner of her other eye. So not moving my finger, I'm double checking that this eye is the same measurement as the first eye. And that's about where we're at. Okay, so if you don't have that much clearly drawn on yours, go ahead and put that in. Just so that we know what we're measuring over here. So here is one eye. You can make a mark with your brush. Two, that eye in the middle, and then the other eye. Okay, so we're pretty close there. Just gonna redraw these just a little bit, just so I can see. All right. So now I'm going to put a slight shadow over her forehead. Now I've wiped most of the color off my brush, but there's still enough on there that I can sort of just gently lay in a value over that area. Okay. So feeling like that's getting to be about in place, I'm going to put a darker value just over this area where her hair is to help frame in where I want things to go. That dark shouldn't be there. And that's a little bit more blue and brown. And then framing around this eye. Just give that a sense of the head plane turns about there. We'll just let that hair shadow kind of just fall on her forehead in here. Just a little bit. Well, it just gives us a little bit to work with back in there. Okay, now cleaning my brush off very well. All that's on my brush right now is just a little bit, I just dried it off on my paper towel. There's just a little bit of thinner in the bristles. So I'm going to come over here and rub a little bit out of where I gessoed on the canvas. And you can take some of that and rub it off. I'm going to rub down her nose a little bit to give us that feeling there. And then there's a little bit of value change over here on this cheekbone. Okay. And we can hit those highlights a little bit brighter as we get going along. But for now, that gives us a little bit of dimension to her cheeks. Okay, and now we're gonna get back the nose that we lost. So I'm squinting down at her nose and I'm looking at the shadow shape that is created by it. And every now and then I wipe my brush off, just so that it's not so dark. And this shadow comes around to form a nice frame for her cheek over here. And over here a little bit too. Okay, so I want to come back up in here and start sort of sculpting out those eyes just a little bit. I clean my brush off, wipe it off, and then I'll come back in here and rub and wipe. And rub that out and wipe it. And then with a dry brush, I'll soften some of those hard edges that I did. Okay, like that. Sort of reshape what was going on in here and over here. Okay, now cleaning my brush off really good, giving a good swish. I'm going to reshape the nose right here with just a gentle curve like that. Children's noses are much shorter than we think they are. So what you can do is double check the width between the eyes. Maybe we'll just take one eye, and then I'll measure how far down the nose goes from that eye. So here is the eye again, right there. Now I'm going to go to the first nostril and go up, straight up. From that nostril, where the tip of my thumb is, to the tip of the brush, goes right up to the eye. So a child's nose, or at least hers is, the length here is the same as the width of one eye. So I'm going to come over here to this eye, and there's that. And then I'll go backwards, putting my thumb at the corner of the eye. I know that the nostril should be right about in there, and I'm holding on to that with my eye. So the nostril is in there, and the other one is over here. So I'm going to kind of clean that up a little. And then you can also come over here and draw straight lines going up from the edge of the nose to see where it intersects with the eye. The edge of that nostril goes right to the corner of the eye, so I'm bringing this down over here, and that is where the edge of her nose will be. Let me make that a little darker. And then over on this side, the edge of that nostril goes up to the corner of that eye. All right, so that's right there. Make that a little darker. Okay. Cleaning my brush off, wiping it off. There's still residue in there, so with that I can rub out the sides of her nose. Rub, wipe. Rub a little bit, and you wipe. Let me come around to this side. Just making that a little bit straighter in there. So sometimes you can grab things on the tip of your brush, just paint and pigment and move it around a little bit that way too. It's kind of like shading with the pencil. You just grab a little bit of it and move it and soften, and then you wipe. And then up the side of the nose. Always letting your brushstroke show the form and topography of what it is you're working on. So cleaning my brush off, and sometimes I don't wipe it as well because I want more Gamsol in my bristles so that I can get more of a rubbed down to the canvas appearance. I want a brighter, whiter spot. Round up my paper towel just to really get a strong highlight in there. We'll rub that out. It's almost down to bare canvas. So now, putting that down, wiping all the Gamsol out of my bristles, I'm going to go back and soften some of that just because I don't need a big, broad, white expanse. so we're getting somewhere now there with that. It's starting to really look like, and this is Naomi, by the way. This is my daughter. My other daughter took this picture. So we are using what I have on hand. So now I'm looking at the way that the cheek comes around down the side of her nose. I'm just cleaning that up a little bit in there. And I'm looking at the shape of her cheek. This one has sort of the light area is a little bit more squarish and it angles back. So I'm going to pick up some of that and angle it the way I see it. And that will help give us a likeness that way. And then this kind of comes down like this, but we have her cheek curving this way. And then the shadow under her nose is just a very slight, it's a little bit too wide over there. You can use your finger to soften that if you get a little bit too dark. I think that this angle, her upper lip, is defining more of that form. And while I'm thinking about it, I want to put these nostrils in just a little bit darker than what I have. You don't want to go too dark or they'll look piggy. And we don't want that. So if you get them too dark, just wipe your brush off and then go to erase a little bit. Like that. I'm going to fix her eye while I'm looking at it. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Oops. Let's get a nice mixture of that. Okay, we'll always come back to the eyes. Work on those a little bit more later. Okay, now the mouth. Looking at where this mouth lands underneath this eye. So the corner of that mouth is directly under the middle of that iris. And then this mouth, corner of that mouth is directly under almost the corner of that eye. Okay, so we come over here. Then under that eye, we have the corner of the mouth right there. And then under this eye, as we established, the corner of the mouth is right there. So I just want to make sure that this dot is in the right place. So I'm going to measure from this corner of this mouth over to her nostril. That looks about an eye width, but let's double check. So I'm going to come over here and grab that eye again. Remember I called that my truth? Come over here, and I'm going to measure from the corner of her mouth up to the nostril, and that is about that eye width. So coming over here, grabbing this eye, and then I'm going to check here with my thumb and my finger, so I need to bring that dot up a little bit. I had it too low. So we'll erase that. And that's a really easy way you can make an adjustment. And so let's double check how far down this distance is from that nose to the corner of that mouth. So I'm going to grab that same eye and then tip of the brush to the nostril. Okay, so that's a little bit further. The distance of the eye is longer than that, so I need to make sure that that is a little bit longer over here too. Let's go vertical because that's easier. Okay, so I need to bring that dot up too. It's too low. It's about right there. So let's erase that. Okay, now it's just a matter of connecting the dots. So we've got this corner of the mouth and this corner of the mouth established. it angles down a little bit in the middle and then up, just a little. Okay, and it's a little bit thinner. Okay, so reworking some of these shadows now as they come down to the mouth and then into this shadowed part of the cheek. We're going to work the whole mouth now into the lower area of her face. Again, just burnt sienna. And I'm letting these brush strokes that I'm using kind of define the form of her face. Very gently. Just letting that form. That. And then let's get this a little bit more accurate over here. And her lower lip, she's kind of smiling a little bit there. So in some of that smudging around there, I lost the shadow under her nose here, so I want to make sure that starts to come out. Because this shadow is going to define what's happening under the skin, the teeth and that whole area. We really want to make sure that that is clearly explained. So cleaning my brush off really well. I'm going to rub out some of that. If you need to take some of your paper towel, get it in a little point and rub out some of that anatomy. You can do that. Just a bit of shadow under there. Okay, we'll get that corner back in there a little bit more. Okay, now as we start to sculpt out some of the area down below, the way that that cheek has a cast shadow, and over here, this is quite a bit in shadow. Cleaning my brush off, we're going to come back in here and rub out some of these areas that are getting more light. Wipe. A little bit on her chin. Now I'm going to grab some pigment and put some of the shadow back in here because it got a little bit wiped out. Okay, now we'll pretty much have the mouth and elements in place. What I want to do is just double check the external features, just the outside contours. And so what I want to do now is I want to look at from the mouth to the edge of the face, from the point of the lip here in the middle to the edge of the chin, and then from the edge of this mouth to the edge of the face. So I am looking at that, and then there's her mouth to the chin. And you can measure these and compare them to your eye, as we've been doing. Like that. So I'm just taking those dots and using that pigment to just help move things around a little bit, just to clarify those areas. Now the jaw on a young child comes down further in the face because it's not as developed. So always double check where this angle from the side comes down and angles and turns and goes under. Okay, and a good way to gauge that is by looking at where the edge of the neck hits the face. So I'm drawing a line straight up from the edge of her neck, and I'm seeing that on this side it touches about the corner of that eye over here, but a little bit beyond. So here is the corner of her eye. So the neck is right here. And then on this side, don't assume it's the same on both sides. This one, if I draw a line straight up, it's right at the edge of that iris. And we don't see that very clearly delineated there. So there is the edge of that iris, and it's right about in here. Okay, so the neck is not just a stovepipe straight down. It's made up of two muscles that hold it up this way and this way. And then what we see is the trapezius behind it. So I'm going to just put a darker value underneath her chin. And I'm using this to help sculpt out the drawing of her face and chin. Very carefully bringing my brush right up to the edge of her face. Bringing that down. And now I'll just gently suggest that the rest of this goes off into wherever. Okay, so let's sculpt in some of this background a little bit to get that feeling a little bit more accurate there. Just taking my brush, cleaning it off a little bit to eat away at some of that pigment. Just to help explain that there. And we'll do some more to this side over here. Okay, so I think that that's okay for that. But I want to come back up into here, and if this part of her chin right in here is light, and it is appearing light because we have a darker shadow underneath it, then that means that right here where the cheek is not in front of something dark will have to appear darker. Same thing with on this side too. So I'm just taking my brush with some of this pigment on it and darkening in where I see the dark shadow area on her cheek over here. Same thing with this side. Okay, now feeling that is pretty much in place. I'm going to get some dark on here for her hair. And so far I still haven't really got into the linseed oil at all. Very, more or less, pretty thin. And then over here a little bit more. Now I'm going to give her a little bit more cranium up here because that wasn't completely finished to accuracy up here. I'm going to let some of that edge just kind of back into the background. Same thing with over here. And I do want to take and rub out a little bit of where some of this hair highlight would be getting the light. And rinse the brush off very well, rub it off. And we're just going to scratch that really clear around my paper towel. And pull. It doesn't matter if I get a swatch that's too big because I'll come back through there then and clean that shape up. Okay, I'm just going to pause for a moment and come back up here. There's very little paint on my brush, but I just wanted to get some of the eye in here a little bit more accurate, only because we really just look at the eyes a lot in a portrait, and I'll make sure that these are reading exactly right. And this is a nice dark on here, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. I'm going to make her looking more like she's looking over this way because I do like how she's kind of looking that way. And wiping my brush off, I'm going to just wipe out some of the pigment there. And you can see how I just lifted away a little bit there. And then I'm using it to just scrape a little bit of the pigment at the bottom. And I think that about covers that for that eye. And now flicking my eye back and forth, I really want to make sure that these two match. Now, unlike doing the last portrait we did, these two are pretty much the same. Okay. Now I'm looking at the top of this eye. And again, I'm making sure that my edges are very soft, even though it's just kind of a quick study. Imagine if I had really sharp, crisp edges in here, it just wouldn't. All right. There's a little. Okay. So now I'm double checking that both of these eyes are looking in the correct direction. Okay, now there are some little bit darker value patches in here that are a little darker. than what I have. So I'm just taking a little bit of sienna and making sure that these eye socket areas are, if they're not the right value, it won't look like they dip in enough. So I really want to make sure that they're the right value. And same with over here. Really sculpting out the shape of her head. And even though this is a little brush, I'm just keeping my brushwork, I'm trying to keep it as muted and as quiet as possible so that it doesn't really call a lot of attention. If I make it too dabbity dab dab, it'll really, you'll look at it, and I don't want that to happen either. So that is, it gets to a place where it's just picking up more than I want it to. A little more sienna in here. I'm cognizant of the temple over here and where it turns from the eyebrow right here, and I'll make the eyebrow just a little bit more noticeable. Here. I'll clean that brush off, wipe it off very, very well. Like this, and I just want the slightest value change right here. You can even just apply a little bit of the wetness from your bristles to an area, and then I'll come back in here and press. I'm not really rubbing, I'm just pressing to lift some of that out. Rub and press. Push a little bit of that. Okay, so now that's starting to really take on some form. So I'm going to come back in here a little bit more now and pull in this darker value where I had it. The shape of the bridge of her nose kind of was getting lost a little bit in there. Our darker eyebrow coming in here. I just love painting my daughter. She has just the kindest heart. For anybody who ever gets to know this sweetheart, she is every bit the angel that she appears, and I'm not just saying that because I'm her mom. And we go places, and she's got more friends of all ages. In fact, a lot of the elderly people from our church ask, "Where's Naomi? I brought this for Naomi," or "I had to tell her something." It's nice. She's my very pleasant sweetheart. Her name means pleasant. Naomi means pleasant. And her middle name is Joy. So it's just so appropriate. Taking this little brush and coming back up in here just to unify some of those darker patches of hair. I don't want these little teeny brush strokes to really be noticeable, so I'm really just working to blend those in with the existing passages of dark. And same thing with over here. But it's important to me that those have the appearance of casting a strong enough shadow under her, the hair here on her forehead. So bigger brush, a little bit more aggressive up in here. More sienna and blue. So far, that's all I've been using is little sienna and blue. And I'll come under here and pull a few strands down under her cheek. Just pull in a few over here. Okay, I'm coming back to my little brush. I'm pretty satisfied with the look in her eyes and where those are going, the angles here. I've got a little bit of just a little more contour passages in here. I'm wiping my brush off quite a bit. Just dab a little. Reshaping. What you do though at this point is just go back through and refine some of the drawing things that maybe need a little bit of help, a little bit of attention. So the bottom of her nose there just needed a little bit of shape refinement. So I'm wiping the brush off very well and then just kind of using it almost as you would a Q-tip, just to kind of pick up and dab some of those passages that needed that help. A little pigment here and there. That's too much. So if you get that too strong, just do a really good job wiping your brush off, and then you can use it as an eraser. See? No problem. Just pull it right back. There's really nothing you can't fix. So you just, if you make a mistake, you go back over it, clean it up. That's all there is. And I think that this cheek has a nice form there, so we'll kind of just let that live there. Soften that. A little bit of a reflected light under her chin. So with my brush that's barely dampened with the Gamsol, I'm just rubbing that a little bit. Wiping it off. I'm just going to lose that right back to that background because I think that's a nice area to lose it. Same thing with over here on this side. And just soften that. And bring this darker just down this way a little more. Need more pigment, less thinner. So I'm cleaning my brush off and I'm going to soften all that. Wipe. Wipe. And all of this gets a nice shadow down here. And her ear. It's very dark back in here. And just let that fade too. And again, just pushing this a little darker down here. It's very, very much like drawing all of this. And I love this soft curve of her cheek over here, and I really want to, I don't want to just kind of guess at the roundness. I really want to get that exact shape of the shadow and the amount of highlight as it's relating to the shadow. And I noticed too, if you get it too blotchy, it'll look like a 5 o'clock shadow. So you want to make sure not to get that too hairy looking in there. A little bit more in here. I'm gonna grab some dark for her hair. I need to kind of sculpt this a little bit closer to the side of her eye there. I really have to watch those distances. Okay, so I think that that has a nice side plane to the side of her face, and then this curve as it comes down around has a nice feeling of roundness there, so I'm going to let that just live there. But the highlight on this side of her face comes down too low, or the eyeshadow down here comes down too low. So with a very clean brush, a little bit of Gamsol on it, I'm bringing that back up to where it belongs. And you can see I'm just wiping my brush off very frequently here. And flicking my eye back and forth quite a bit. Watching these angles. Now this line here got too strong, so I just wipe my brush very well. Like that. I want to soften this side of her nose shadow very delicately here. Rub this out. Now grabbing a little bit of more of the alizarin and blue, I want this to be a little bit more accentuated down here where her mouth is. Very delicately, very carefully defining the little thing that she's doing with her mouth, just kind of tucking her lower lip a little bit tighter in her mouth. So we'll just pull that in like that, very subtle. Same thing with the corner over here, a little bit darker blue in that corner. And then I'm just going to take the little bit of pigment that's on my brush and help identify where that upper lip is. And then over here, it's the lower lip that is getting some coloring. Just a very subtle difference here. On this side, there's more color. And then on this side, on the highlighted passage, the upper lip has more color. Okay, so cleaning my brush, drying it off very, very well. I'm gonna pull out a little bit more of the highlight on the upper lip in the shadow. Pick up some pigment to refine the shape. And that's what you do for that. Just going to erase some more of that. Alright, now I'm picking up a little pigment, and I really want to now kind of refine the shadow shape on her chin. Alright, and then right down here, there's a little bit darker area before it gets to the light. And we're going to play with some of that. That's the bounce light that's under her chin. So I'll soften that, because we don't want a sharp edge there. Alright, and then just in a few places I want a little bit darker where her neck is, just on her neck. And that is ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Just a nice little sharp accent there. Let's pick up some more actual pigment and get that a little bit more there, like that. Okay, now I'm just going to take a little bit of cadmium red with some white, and that is just cadmium red and some white. Now this is barely on my brush. I'm going to wipe most of that off like this. I'm only going to put it in about where that light, that shadow meets the light. Just in a few places. Her nose. cheek over here in this shadow area. A little bit on her chin. Wiping my brush off, I'm going to totally clean it off, rub clean it. And now I'm just going to soften that where that I put that. I'm going to have to continually be wiping my brush, because when you work to blend a passage where you put a little bit of color, if you don't continually wipe your brush, you're going to be just kind of moving that same pigment around and around and around. So just wipe and soften. And over here. And a little down here. I do want that a teeny bit brighter down there. Okay, I'm just going to take a little bit of yellow ochre and mix it with that cadmium mixture, just a little bit. And I'm just going to do a thin shadow passage up here. You can see it's just very, very suggested. And that just makes it look like her hair up there is casting a bit of a shadow. And I'm going to darken that a little bit to give us some boundaries. Okay, now cleaning my brush off, I'm going to come back through here and rub out some more delicate passages where the highlight of her hair is getting a strong light on it. A little bit more. Just going to take a little bit here and pull some of this down. Okay. That's as far as I'm going to take this one. So no white, just leave it the white of the canvas. Okay, so I'm just noticing a few areas here that I want to work on a little bit more. The mouth drops down a little bit too far. Off. I noticed I had too bright of a value in this area, and so I really do want to just put a thin layer on this. So if you get something too light, it's easier to go lighten something if it's too dark, but to darken something that's a little bit too light, all you do is just put a very thin layer. Sometimes it's just simply a matter of taking the pigment that's in an area too and just moving it around over an area. So you can kind of just rub that a little bit, just very subtle, just like that. So I'll keep all these very soft in here. I don't want anything too sharp, especially when you're dealing with the mouth. It can tend to look kind of painted on, so you have to be very delicate with that. So I really did want to kind of define some of her anatomy in here a little bit better too. Sometimes when a good thing you can do to really double check where you are is to take a picture of your work on your phone or whatever, and then look at it small, and then what you see is a lot of things start to pop out to you, and you notice, oh, that's not right, that value should be lighter, should be darker, or you know, things maybe aren't in the right place. So it gives you an opportunity to make those adjustments. So this value passage right in here was a little bit too dark, so I'm really rubbing the paint and the Gamsol out of my brush just a little bit, so like that. I'm just taking a thin layer of that down so that there's just a little bit left there. It's not rubbed all the way down to the canvas, but it's just a really thin layer. And then we'll soften that transition right there. And then I noticed that when I put that pink layer on here, it kind of brought too much of a value up into this lit area where I really wanted a stronger highlight. So I'm pulling this lighter value back down this way into the side of her cheek just a little bit more. That gives it a little bit more area for the light to be hitting that, and it just makes it appear a little bit more full. And I like that a little better there. So really a lot of this is a matter of drying my brush off and wiping it off as I'm moving pigment around. Now with a painting like this, I really do kind of like this rougher, unfinished state. So I'm probably not going to take and push this painting any further than what you see here in this lesson today. But if you wanted to, on your own time, you know enough about mixing colors and you have some information over here that you could push this to a higher finish. But today, for the purpose of this lesson, I really just want to keep this focused on, again, just foundational studies. It's really just, that was my target today. And I wanted a little bit more sienna in her neck. I noticed it just looked a little bit too separated, like the flesh of her neck didn't belong to her face. So it was a little too much blue, so I added a little bit more sienna here, keeping my edges very soft. Necks have more to do with the background than they do with the foreground. So that's fine. Just keeping that quiet there. Again, just pulling some of these shadows. I just want these a little bit more delineated. Now, there's some passages in here around her eyes that I thought were not really reading accurately. And for this matter, instead of using more turpentine or Gamsol, I'm going to just use a little bit of oil. Since this is no longer just sort of my underpainting, but this is the finished painting. So a little bit of oil into this mixture is totally acceptable, just to kind of put some of that finishing touch on these passages in here. Keep this kind of more shadowed in here. And clean my brush off very well, and then drag this shadow onto her forehead a little bit here. And I'm just going to sort of smooth all this out a little bit in here. I just felt it was a little too blotchy. Maybe I'll just take a little bit of yellow ochre and some burnt sienna into her hair a little bit. Right there. And just a little bit in here. Clean my brush off very well and rub this out. Now I'm just scanning back and forth to see if there's anywhere else that needs a little bit more refinement. And I think that the tip of her nose could be a little bit wider, a little bit more childlike. And I like that value there a little better. It just seems to have more of that highlighted area on that side of her face. I might even just take a little bit of this pigmentation here, this color, and just drag it over here a little tiny bit, just to let that go a little bit more into shadow. And bring this shadow up a little. I'm going to just take a little bit of this highlight here and bring it down into here a little bit. So what I noticed again too is that some of these values that I thought were light, like down and around here, were not as light as I painted them. So I'm just muting them, and I really just want the ones that are light to really bounce. So before I get into that, the passage here above her eye appears to make it look like she's got a hooded eyelid, which ages her. And in painting children, you have to really watch for those things that can age your person. You don't want it to do that. Darker eyebrows on a child will age them too, so make sure that your children have the correct value of their eyebrows. And bring this up a little bit more. Okay, so what I did here is I connected the darker value of her eye with the shadow. I just brought those all together. I think that that gave it a stronger sense of unity in there. Okay, a little bit of her eyebrow here. Oops. A little bit of sienna, ochre for this under her hair here. Okay, now just refining the shape of her chin. A little bit of cadmium red over here just to give that some glow. I just like that. And I'll rub some of this out a little bit too. Now just little pops of accents and we're done. I just want to lighten her nostril there a little bit. Okay, I feel better about that. You can take a clean brush at the end and just soften some of these transitions a little bit. I think I'm even going to take and go a little bit of a highlight of some white, just a little tiny bit, right in here. It's very subtle. A little bit down her nose. And then maybe just, if I mix a little bit of yellow ochre with that white, and I put some in her hair. And that's it. Okay, that wraps this one up. Thank you so much for joining me.